An interview guide is a really useful tool for doing qualitative research. It really enables us to kind of elicit from an individual, from an interview participant, their experience. And that's exactly what they're supposed to do. An interview guide isn't just a series of questions like you would use in a survey where you're expecting a specific set of responses. An interview guide is really meant to get the participant talking about their experience, about their understanding, about their life. And so if you're using it just to get a specific set of responses, then you're not using the right tool. You should be using a survey or a survey instrument of some sort. So interview guides really focused here on getting somebody to start talking about themselves, their experience, their life. It's not something that you should take as written in stone. So interview guides, almost by definition, are meant to be adapted and adaptable to the situation, to the person's experience, to their knowledge, and to their understanding of the world. So it's literally a guide. It's just meant to give you direction and maybe ideas of things to talk to the person about. And they can come in different forms as well. So you can have like an unstructured interview guide, which I really just think of as kind of a series of bullet points or topics that you want to talk about. You can think of a semi-structured interview guide where it's like actual questions and maybe they're grouped in a specific order and grouped in a specific way. And in a structured interview guide, I think would be more along the lines of a survey, closer to an actual set of responses that you give a person when you're asking them a specific question. So when I'm interviewing somebody for my research, I'm typically using a semi-structured interview guide. And so I'll sit them down and I'll ask them some questions just to kind of get them talking about their life. And I don't necessarily ask those questions in that specific order that they're laid out on the guide. I might start with the first question and jump immediately to the fourth question and down to the last question and back up to the second question. I might ask the first question in different ways more than once. I might paraphrase things really in a way that speaks to that person's experience and speaks to something that they may have said earlier in the interview. And I may just leave questions out entirely. I just may not ask them that question because their experience just doesn't fit with what that question was trying to get at. So the questions that you end up asking the person, even though some of them might be on the interview guide, are really only there in order to get them to talk and should be adapted to their experience. So if you find that the person's experience means that they won't necessarily have very good answers to 3, 4, 5 of the questions, just toss them out. Maybe you ended up interviewing somebody and they had a whole different set of experiences than you expected them to have, in which case you might look at your interview guide and say, hey, none of these questions are going to work. Toss out those questions, look at that person in the face, and just ask them to talk about their experience with this, that, or the other thing, any kind of topics that might be relevant for your research. Because you never know, that person might have something packed up in their brain, something packed up in their history that they can bring out for you that will show that, wow, there was actually 4 or 5 questions that were not even on the interview guide that I should have included on there because they're really, really, really important to my area of investigation. So the interview guide is a guide. You should always use it as a starting point for getting somebody to talk about their experiences. Now, when I'm creating an interview guide, what I usually do is brainstorm a whole bunch of questions that I might want to ask somebody. And often I'll start with general topics. So I might lay out 3, 4, 5 topics. And then I'll think, okay, topic A, I want to ask them maybe these 3 questions. Topic B, I'll ask them 5 questions. Topic C, ask them 2 questions. Topic D, etc., etc. Then I go back through them and I kind of think more critically, more carefully. Actually, I don't need these 2 topics. I'll just focus on these 3. Maybe this section could be a little longer, maybe this section a little bit shorter. So I really try to be structured in my approach to creating those questions. When I'm ordering those questions, and especially when I'm doing those interviews, I always start out with general questions that are easy to answer or easy to kind of think of answers. Maybe they're challenging in the sense that they ask a really big question, but they should be something that the participant can readily approach and offer an answer, even if it's just kind of a, whoa, this is what I think. Those are really, really important to start off with. And then you go down into increasingly narrower and more challenging, more difficult questions. So maybe your research topic, maybe your aim is really concrete, specific, and really, really difficult to kind of get to or ask somebody right off the bat. So you start with something broader, easier for them to understand, easier for them to relate to, and then you kind of guide them into that more formative, challenging, difficult question that you want to ask. That will help the participant. It'll help guide them into that experience and to guide them into what specifically you're interested in talking to them about. I also make sure that I have like a standard set of questions that I kind of draw from in doing the interview. Maybe they're 10 questions. I think 10's generally a good ballpark number for me in the way I interview. 10 questions often end up with like a 30-minute, 45-minute interview, depending on the participant, of course. Sometimes you'll have 10 questions you'll ask a participant and then 10 minutes they're done and they're not offering you anything else. Sometimes you'll have 10 questions you ask an interview participant, the first 2, and then an hour later you get to ask the 3rd question. You kind of have to feel out the interview participant, and maybe that hour answering those 3 questions is all you need. Maybe you need to continue going on with them, and of course always kind of respond to their needs, right? They're volunteering their time often, and so you don't want to necessarily ask them for a 60-minute interview and then you're interviewing them for 2 hours. Make sure that they're giving consent to being interviewed for that long, if it's going longer than you expect. So I'll get 10 questions right off the bat. Those are my kind of base questions that I ask. And then I'll add maybe 5 or 7, even 10 supplementary questions. Questions that I want to ask, but maybe aren't appropriate for all my participants, or questions that may be appropriate if I have time after I've asked those first 10 baseline questions. That gives me something else to draw on. If a participant's answering things very short and matter-of-factly, I get through my 10 and I have these 10 others. I can kind of query them on those and get their understanding for what that is. And then I always ask at the end of an interview, I always make sure also that towards the end of the interview, like the last substantive question that I'm asking, it happens like 10 minutes before the actual stop time of the interview. So then that leaves a little bit of space at the end to ask a couple of more questions, which I attach to any interview I do. Number 1, are there questions that I haven't asked that I should be asking? That gives the participant an opportunity to say, actually, you know what you didn't ask was this, and this is a really important issue to talk about. And then you can get their response to that. And it also helps inform you whenever you go back and revise your interview guide, you can add that question later if you think it's important enough to ask everyone. So that's one question that I always ask at the end of every interview. The other question, and this might sound basic, but it's really, really important. You just ask them, is there anything else you would like to tell me? Is there anything else that you think is important about this issue that you would like to get across? Again, that just gives the participant a chance to reflect on the interview that they've just had, their experience and knowledge in this field, and really give you that last little bit of confirmation, maybe about something they had already said, some extrapolation, maybe something they said, but they didn't get to go into enough detail because you had to go on with the next question, or it gives them a chance to go into an entirely different direction and say, actually, you should know this, and then they will tell you this. Of course, always thank them for their time and their energy and their voluntary participation. And we'll go into a little bit more of that in a different interview. But basically, when it comes to interview guides, I want you to think in 3 ways here. First of all, it's about understanding the other person's experience. Nothing else matters than their experience. The whole process of getting interviews is about understanding their experience. Number 2, when you're interviewing, don't be afraid to skip questions, rephrase questions, add questions that aren't on your interview guide. The guide is just a guide. It is not set in stone. And number 3, mechanics of interview guides, start with 10 questions, have a supplementary questions available to you. Make sure that you start from big and easy to small, concrete and challenging. Make sure you're asking them, are there any other questions that I haven't asked that I should be asking? And do you have anything to add at the end of the interview? And in that way, you're going to be an excellent, excellent interviewer.